Hello and welcome to this Gluware Overview session. This session is targeted towards those who are about to get started using Gluware. This could be through our test drive or the free offering, which I'm going to talk about. Maybe you're beginning to evaluate Gluware within your enterprise, or maybe you're moving towards deployment. So whichever the case, what we're going to cover here is at a high level, what is Gluware? We're going to go through the applications and use cases. We're going to cover the architecture of the system and how it runs. And we'll fairly quickly cover the offerings and deployment options if you're going on-prem. So let's get started. So at a high level, Gluware is an intelligent network automation platform. It is a pure software solution that works on top of the existing network. Some of the differentiation and some of the capabilities of it include that Gluware is multi-vendor, it's multi-domain, meaning you can automate the LAN, WAN, data center, cloud architectures. We've just recently expanded into multi-cloud. It's intent-based and provides deep insight and action. And we're going to cover what some of that means as we get into the architecture, but essentially with intent-based, you can define a intended state for a configuration or a policy. Gluware will examine the current state, compare it to the desired state, make those changes required, and ensure you're validated to be in the intended state with the ability to continue to ensure you remain in that state. So that kind of ties into that last point around automation is not a set of individual tasks. It should be really viewed as a continuous flow of deployment, monitoring, auditing, and implementing changes when required, and really being a full circle of the lifecycle management. So we're going to get into how Gluware is able to do that. Looking at this next slide here, we're going to build out the applications that Gluware provides as well as the use cases it addresses. So when you first get started with Gluware, you're going to be primarily starting with the device manager. Device manager, as you can see from the logos provided here, this is where you're really leveraging the concept of the Gluware vendor adapters and the fact that we can speak kind of natively to all of these vendors and their various operating systems. So we're currently at around 30 vendor total operating systems that we're interfacing with. So what you use Device Manager for is to discover the network. You can execute network discovery to find the devices that exist on the network. And then you can use Gluware to interrogate them. So Gluware executes a device discovery and will interrogate and pull out the details so you have a real-time inventory and can be down to a high level of detail, but it pulls out the operating systems running and other very, very useful information. Moving up the stack, the next application users are frequently using is Configuration Drift and Audit. So as the name implies, this is kind of a dual-purpose app. With Drift, you can monitor your devices for config change and see exactly what changed. That's known as config drift. And then you can execute audits. So audits can be for various purposes. They can be for your company policy, for third-party compliance and conformance. As you see here, examples like PCI DSS, HIPAA, NIST, and many others can be executed. So this really helps to enhance your security posture and your ability to remain compliant to the governance or internal company specifications. Again, moving up the stack in terms of apps is normally the next stop is in leveraging the OS Manager. So in those first two applications, they were automating read-only type capabilities. Now as you get into OS Manager and you're automating operating system change, it could be upgrades, downgrades, patches, whatever your goal is in terms of changing an operating system. But as most network engineers know, these processes involve a lot of pre-checks, a lot of validations, a lot of steps to transfer images, validate the image, ensure there's space for the image, and so on and so forth. So all of that is fully automated via the OS Manager application. So it really does facilitate ease when it comes to these now more frequently required upgrades and operating system changes to deal with vulnerabilities or to enable new features on your network. What we like to call the superpower of Gluware is config modeling. Config modeling is our configuration management application, and this is really kind of taking the approach to be really truly centralized and kind of central policy oriented. The way, the perspective of Gluware when it comes to configuration management is to deconstruct a configuration file into individual features, but also still have the awareness and of codependency and how those features may need to interact with each other. But essentially being able to break down into a per feature basis, being able to determine the desired state of those configured protocols, and then have Gluware intelligently go and get to the desired state. And I talked a little bit about this in the beginning, but this is where the intent-based components of Gluware, as well as the declarative nature of it to read current state, compare to what you want, and make the change for you and ensure you're in the intended state without you having to code all of that logic, pre-check, post-check in. And another thing we'll touch on is Gluware's ability to execute state assessment in this app as well. And if you're going through the test drive, you'll be able to run all of these and get a first-hand experience, or really in any mechanism you're consuming Gluware. So again, with config modeling, you're kind of taking, let's say, paper standards or scripts or other things, and you're kind of maturing it into network policy and control. Moving up to stack next is workflows. Workflows are designed to automate any sequence of steps or repeated actions. And some of the workflows can automate steps purely within Gluware. Other workflows can be to integrate with other systems, maybe an ITSM or an IPAM, or maybe it's integrating a troubleshooting workflow. But generally the workflows fall into the categories of design, operate, plan, or troubleshoot, and really can automate any repeated actions. And then we get up to the APIs. And so APIs really work in two directions. One is Gluware APIs, where Gluware can be consumed and called via our programmatic API, we call Glue API. Or Gluware can integrate external API calls, either southbound to the network layer or kind of so-called east-west within the management plane, integrating with ticketing systems like ServiceNow and Remedy. And we've also done integrations with Ansible, with modules and other various components to integrate via API and leverage that. So that's kind of high level, and you get a sense of the application Gluware provides, along with a lot of the high level use cases that Gluware addresses. So moving on, let's take a deeper dive here into the Gluware architecture. What I was describing earlier, I'm going to turn on a laser pointer to help point out, there's a lot going on in this diagram and want to highlight your focus, which is when you're using Gluware, you're generally using Gluware at the application level. Our Gluware primary application is called Gluware Control. Within it, you then access individual applications like Device Manager, Drift and Audit, NOS Manager, and so forth. You also can access Gluware via the REST API. This could be custom API calls or a custom portal built on top of the Gluware APIs. And you can integrate and execute Gluware calls via third parties like I mentioned, Ansible, and others. So that would be kind of more of the triggered, or let's say you have an inventory within an external component, an external system, and you want to push that inventory into Gluware, into our device manager. We could do that via API, and so there could be API integration. But essentially, at this layer, it's like the user interface layer. And for Gluware, we're all browser-based here, and all of our applications interact with our common orchestration engine via API calls. So our direct API calls interface with our WebSocket layer and then access the power of the common orchestration engine. So a few things to point out. If you've looked at forms of automation with scripts, or a lot of the older automation programs we've seen are UI frameworks that really sit on top of scripts. Gluware takes a very different approach to really unify what's happening at the orchestration layer. And so I'm going to come back to that, but really, this box in the middle here is really the power of Gluware and the way we look at networks and treat networks as code. You've probably heard that the term infrastructure is code, and that's essentially what we are doing in terms of when you look down at the lowest level here in the diagram, which is your network devices, potentially virtual network functions, SDN controllers. API endpoints. All of these to us are programmatic interfaces. And so what we're able to do via the various mechanisms of communication, we have the vendor extension layer of where we teach our engine how to speak to the native endpoint. So maybe it's Cisco iOS or Arista EOS or Juniper Junos. It doesn't really matter to us. Once we have our vendor extension built, we are able to essentially read from and speak to, kind of read and write to that native operating system. Whenever Gluware reads from the network layer, so this is when we perform an inventory, when we're reading network state, when we're executing show commands for troubleshooting, everything is converted into the Gluware system as a data model. So we're processing the data models. And in the intelligence that we have, we are, again, have the ability to execute discovery. Our device detect library and capability has a library to interrogate each of the platforms that have been onboarded. When we are executing provisioning, where we're making a configuration change, we're executing a discovery of current state. We analyze codependency and compare it to the desired state. We execute the change or give you the ability to do a preview, and we also do a full validation that the change was successful. And on top of that, you have full logging, and as you kind of look up into this layer, you have full logging of everything that occurred. So kind of in the microservices area, and I think the concept of Gluware being a platform that is modular is very important, because what you'll find is, while we track Gluware with major releases, like our current release is Gluware 4.0, we have the ability to publish capabilities and content into the platform at any time. We can publish new vendor adapters, we can publish a package of new capabilities, we can update various components and make it available through our software distribution center. And you can, on the fly, be updating and adding capabilities along the way without having to wait for a major release. So as we get into the next, if you're going to kind of follow these videos in the series, the next one is around getting started with Gluware and kind of the administrative tasks you take on. And that has to do with creating organizations and users, defining your role-based access control, loading the required packages that you want in your system. For example, if you're using Cisco and Juniper, you may not need other vendor packages, and there's just other options that you'll have. But basically, through the distribution center or through capsules, you loading or populating the Gluware system. And just to kind of round out where we're at here, Gluware, and from the comm standpoint, Gluware has the ability to telnet or SSH, and so that we're using these capabilities to connect and communicate with the devices. But you can also use a terminal window and kind of cut through and get to a prompt directly through Gluware. Gluware also has SOAP and REST capabilities for kind of more modern programmatic interfaces. Gluware supports simple mail transport protocol, and this is really around notification. You can enable notifications via email, and we have syslog integration, which is primarily focused around syslog messages of type 5, which are for the devices to notify Gluware that someone has gone into a configuration mode on them. So syslog of type 5 enable us to correlate things when we get into apps like Drift and Audit. You're going to want to know what user made a change when. The syslog integration helps us to do that. And then on top of the services over here, services primarily are around authentication services. So Gluware does have the ability to define users directly on our system, but usually customers want to integrate authentication of the users with their LDAP or Radius support. So that can be set up as well. So that covers the Gluware system to a certain degree. We're going to, as you get into deployment options, we're going to cover it a little bit more. But that does bring up one final point I'd like to make, which is when Gluware is executing jobs down to the network layer or out to the APIs, it's doing that through what we call provisioning engines at a high level. Again, there's different forms of provisioning engines we'll get into, but the provisioning engines are where the work is done, the discovery down to the network layer, the OS upgrades, the audits. And Gluware has decoupled the provisioning engines from the primary orchestration engine, and we have the ability to scale out the provisioning engine. So where in your default install of a single orchestration engine, you will have 2 provisioning engines, you have the ability to add additional provisioning engines to reach the scale and capacity you would want to. And that really is for when you want jobs done, within a set. Let's say you want to audit 10,000 devices in under an hour. You would add provisioning engines accordingly in the underlying compute to scale and enable that so-called horsepower for Gluware to execute the job. And so we have the ability to kind of manage and track all the jobs Gluware is trying to execute on the network, and the provisioning engines are executing those jobs. So in this next slide here, we're going to talk about offerings. In general, there are 2 big categories of offerings: Pro, which is new, announced in Gluware 4.0, and what we've had in the marketplace for quite a long time, which is Enterprise. So Pro is our AWS hosted software as a service, and this is just becoming one of those things that in the enterprise IT space, more and more companies are looking towards consuming SaaS for many different functions, and now including network management functions. So in the Pro tier, it is multi-tenant and it is hosted in AWS, and you have the ability to then select the tier of Gluware that you want, and the tier is priced on a per device, kind of per month basis, in terms of kind of getting where the pricing point comes in. But there is a free tier, so I did want to bring this out that as we talk about and get into apps, I mentioned Device Manager. Device Manager capability to execute inventory comes in at a free tier of up to 100 devices for a year, and you also get a 45-day trial of config, drift, and audit. So this is a really great first step to take, because once you perform your inventory and you start to drift and you execute some audits, you're going to gain a lot of insight as to what you need to do next. Maybe you need to begin to unify operating system deployments. Maybe you need to strengthen security, in configuration, maybe ACL unification, or maybe you need to remove static passwords. And so you can begin to get into the next tiers of audit where you're, owning you have the full capability of the drift and audit, moving into the automation tier, which adds OS Manager, or moving into the full advanced package, which is the full suite of Gluware applications. So that really kind of covers Pro. When you think Enterprise, really this is where it's just completely flexible. The main piece about Enterprise is that it's for our, let's say, from small all the way up to our XXL customers. So Enterprise is highly flexible in terms of the scale and capacity. It can be on-prem, it can be hosted in the cloud. It really is up to you in terms of how and where you want to run Gluware. I'd say most of our enterprise customers tend to run on-prem just for kind of traditional reasons. And it's really geared toward higher scale and a degree of flexibility with what you're looking to gain from Gluware's network automation. So taking a little bit of a deeper dive into Gluware 4.0, which offers the Pro offering. Again, Gluware Pro is deployed within AWS. So what happens is Gluware deploys an instance of our Gluware orchestration engine into AWS for you, and we take care of all the administrative tasks. So your licensing is taken care of, the initial software packages you need are taken care of, the initial organization and users are set up. Essentially, you're ready to go and just get started automating when you go down really the Pro path. Whereas if you go the enterprise route, there are a number of the administrative tasks you will take on yourself, but again, it does give you many more degrees of flexibility and freedom depending on what you're trying to achieve. So again, with Pro, we deploy an AWS for you, and it's multi-tenant, but essentially all you do is you jump in, you would run our Gluware Secure Gateway, usually deploy 2 of these for redundancy purposes, but we deploy these as an OVA, so it's a virtual machine, and you deploy these on your prem, and that becomes the provisioning engine. That's why you have these little icon of these engines All of the so-called provisioning is executed locally from the Gluware secure gateway down to the network nodes, and only communication and control information goes over the encrypted path back to your primary orchestration engine. So while your software is running in the cloud, all of the engine capability in terms of the connectivity, the reading and writing to the devices, whatever it's doing in the interrogation and discovery and audits, is all happening essentially on-prem. So data is encrypted, in transit and at rest. And again, with being a software as a service model, you can subscribe to an audit tier first, and then as you audit your network, you can move up into the next tier where you're adding OS Manager, and you can progress into full-blown configuration management. So you have kind of that more kind of flexibility as to how you consume Gluware. Looking at the enterprise offering, as kind of covered in the, when I introduced it, is that enterprise is just highly flexible. Gluware is delivered as OVAs, or virtual machines, that can run, and we support running wherever you need to run them. So they most commonly run on compute, on virtual machines within your data center, like on a ESXi VMware host, but they can also run within your Azure network. They can run within your AWS cloud. Another option with enterprise offering is that Gluware could even host it within our cloud as a private tenant or single tenant hosted. So again, a lot of flexibility in terms of how Gluware is deployed. The next major metric to look at with the enterprise offering is that there's really no limit to the number of devices you could manage. And we have deployments in the multi-tens of thousands already in production. And this is really where it comes down to the power of the Gluware engine servers, which are essentially assigned into zones for localized communication and high performance. So anywhere where you have a lot of nodes, in this kind of example we're kind of laying out here, where your network might be across APAC, America, EMEA, you can deploy multiple Gluware zone engines into these regions and handle the performance accordingly. So there's really no set limit as to how many zones you could have or how many zone engines within each zone. So this gives you really highly scalable option, and this is oftentimes one of the main reasons customers choose to go in the enterprise if they're a global network or require really high performance when it comes to the number of network nodes they're executing drifts and audits and provisioning tasks on. So that's really the high level overview of Gluware Enterprise. So the last piece we're going to cover in this overview is deployment options when you're going on-prem. So when you're going on-prem or really selecting enterprise where Gluware is delivering you just purely software and we're not hosting it for you, you're going to install it either in your data center or in your cloud. We deliver as OVAs, and one of the first options is what we call kind of really the all-in-one. All-in-one is where Gluware is running as a single virtual machine image. And so the Gluware orchestration engine itself, the servers, the full database, really the full architecture of Gluware is delivered and can run as a single virtual machine. So this type of deployment really is primarily for test and lab environments, because you're, depending on how you're managing your virtual machines, you're not particularly getting to the highest degree of redundancy, resiliency, or scale. So that moves us on to option number 2, which is where you introduce a Gluware disaster recovery server as well. So I would say, a high degree, or pretty much all our enterprise customers who go on-prem deploy their primary server, and they deploy the Gluware disaster recovery server, which is really, I don't know if you'd call it a warm standby, but essentially there's database synchronization happening where when you switch over to it doesn't switch over for you, but when you initiate a switchover, you have full database state synchronization, so your disaster recovery server can take over. So I would say this is also very good. And when you're running a primary server and a disaster recovery server, that those engines are not taking on jobs while the engine is not running. So you do just still have your two primary engines running jobs. And that really leads us into the third option, which is depending on how many network devices you're executing, and it, in our kind of benchmarking in say recommendations or observations, and it really, your mileage does vary in terms of network speeds and the underlying horsepower, compute power you've allocated, and what kind of guidelines you followed. So lots of caveats there. But basically, into the third option is for our large to extra large deployments. And again, we've gone to very, very high scale deployments where you have your primary server, you have your disaster recovery server, and then you have one or more additional Gluware Zone Engine servers. And so again, just think of those Zone Engine servers as distributed horsepower. And then what happens is, the devices within a given zone point to that Gluware Zone Engine as their primary server for all the Gluware jobs. But if, let's say, that VM were to crash or something were to happen in that infrastructure, they would fall back to the primary engine server if there wasn't, let's say, another Zone Engine available in that region. So it gives you a high degree of scale. It gives you a high degree of uptime or availability in your infrastructure. So at that point, that covers the introduction or the overview of Gluware to give you a high-level perspective, let you understand the apps and the architecture and the deployment options. In the next video in this series, we're going to jump into the administrative tasks that you do and then go through each one of the applications and use cases that you can follow along with the test drive or your deployment of Gluware. Thank you.